Now here's a plant you've probably heard of, but might not be able to identify very well. And I'm honestly not the best at it because I'm not allergic to these types of plants that much. But if you're one of the people who's allergic to poison ivy, this is not going to be a fun time. Now, if you spent any time in the wilderness, you've probably been told about the three plants poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac. This is poison sumac, the less common but arguably worst of the three. Now, as far as what this plant will do to you, it's basically the same as poison ivy, just don't get the sap on contact with your skin, don't eat it, especially the berries. Although, if this plant does produce fruit, I'll do an entire separate video on those. Now, as for people who are like, oh dear God, why are you touching it if it's poison sumac? I have never really broken out from poison ivy. And while as far as I know, it's technically possible to have an allergic reaction to this plant if you're immune to poison ivy and poison oak, this is due to the fact that the urushiol, which is the actual chemical compound that causes the allergic reaction, being slightly different in all three. I'm not too worried because you actually have to damage the plant for that to be a concern, and I'm gingerly touching the leaves. This also leads into a potential identification characteristic, which is what really set the nail in the coffin for this, in my mind, probably being poison sumac. You see that dark coloration around where it was damaged? Further down the stem you can see even more. That's caused by the urushiol oxidizing. Now luckily, at least to me, this is a fairly eye-catching plant and one that's fairly easy to identify. I mean, I'm not very good at it, I rarely ever see this plant, and it was still eye-catching enough for me to double take and go, hey, isn't that poison sumac? Now while both poison ivy and poison oak have the leaves of 3 patterning, this plant is different. It has 7 to 13 leaves along this center stem here. The center stem is bright red, as are the undersides of the leaves to an extent. And the leaves themselves have no defensive characteristics and they're very smooth. No sort of teeth on the edge, no hairs on the underside. In general, the plant has no defensive characteristics to it that would protect it from insects or other animals, and yet it's completely untouched, which likely means that it's poisonous even without having to identify it as a specific species. Now, luckily this plant grows in swampy areas, so you're unlikely to come across it if you're just walking in the woods in sort of like an upland forest. But there are other species of plants that are quite nice that also grow in these same conditions. Notably, this lovely plant is growing right in the blueberry patch. I could very easily see someone, myself included, sort of muscling my way in here to reach for some berries, and my leg brushing up against this plant right here, especially since, you know, not that far off where it would sort of brush up against it. And especially sort of reaching in, leaning in, and pushing yourself just close enough to the berries, I could very easily see damaging the plant and getting that urushiol on your skin, which, especially if you're quite allergic to it, is not going to be fun. Now, personally, I'm not going to test the theory that I'm not that allergic to this plant any more than I already have, you know, touching the leaves and in general showing you guys this plant. It is entirely possible that I could have no reaction to poison ivy and have a horrible reaction to this plant. As far as I know, at least. But you really shouldn't be too afraid of this plant because it's just not as common as poison ivy and the like. I would say to be aware of it, especially if you're near a lakeside or anywhere else that may have swamp-dwelling plants. Basically, if you can see that there are blueberries, if you can see that there are swamp roses or water hemlock or any of those swamp-dwelling plants, then you should be aware that this plant might also be there. Overall, this plant is not out to get you. Just be careful not to trample over it while on your way to get some delicious wild fruit. Anyway, I do hope you learned something, enjoyed, and as always, I wish you the best. Till next time.